Hey everyone, Kristen from Media Peruana Knits here with you today to bust some myths about knitting. I obviously love knitting, and in my many years of doing so have come across some rather incorrect beliefs about knitting. So I thought it was time to take a few minutes and bust right through some of those so that we're all better educated about knitting and how awesome it is. Number one. No one knits anymore. This is patently untrue. Now, how much interest in knitting we can pin on the pandemic and people being stuck at home, I don't know, but millions and millions of people knit. The estimate for just the United States is that about 45 million people know how to knit. But the United States is actually not one of the top 5 countries for knitting. Those 5 countries are Australia, New Zealand, Iceland, the UK, and Canada. Those are the top 5 countries with the largest percentage of the population knowing how to knit. So, lots of people still knit. Now, of course, knowing how to knit and actively knitting are 2 different things, but I will also mention that Ravelry, which is a sort of combination database / social media site for fiber artists, that is knitters, crocheters, spinners, and weavers, I would say heavily falling to the knitting side of that, has 9 million members. So these are people who actively knit and want to be part of this community. So while I do not have any exact numbers for how many people knit in the entire world, I can tell you that lots and lots of people knit and crochet. The idea that nobody does it anymore is just patently incorrect. Lots of people do, lots of people enjoy it, and even people who don't actively knit, there's still a large percentage of people who do know how to knit and crochet. So knitting, actually pretty popular. Number 2, knitting is hard. Knitting is not hard. That's not to say that it is easy, but knitting, much like learning to type or learning to play an instrument, involves practicing to the point that you develop muscle memory. So people who have been knitting for years, the actual act of knitting is very easy. We don't even think about it. Our hands just go. Just like when you have to type an email and your hands, the same is true of knitting. And probably crochet. I don't crochet. So the idea that it is hard, it's not hard. If you have 2 hands, you can probably knit. However, it is a learning process and it can be frustrating because you have to develop that muscle memory in order to get good at it and fast at it. And that is where a lot of people kind of lose interest. You do have to practice. It will be awkward at first. It will feel awkward to try to hold the needles and move the yarn. But that will gradually go away as you practice until you reach the point that it becomes, again, muscle memory, and your hands will basically just work on their own. So, knitting itself, not hard. Learning to knit, not so much hard as requires patience and practice. But you can definitely learn to knit. There's nothing inherently difficult about it. Knitting is boring. I suppose that's a matter of opinion, but the thing is that once you have developed that muscle memory, you can do a lot of other things while you knit. You can watch TV. Some people can read books if you have an e-reader or a Kindle. You can take a walk and carry your knitting with you and knit, and your fingers will just go. Pretty much any activity that you do that doesn't require you to use your hands, you can knit while you're doing that activity. It's very portable. It can come with you if you have kids and you have to go to various children's sporting events, plays. You have to go to, PTA meetings, things like that. You can bring your knitting. And again, once you develop that muscle memory, you really won't even have to look at your hands unless you're doing something particularly complicated with your knitting. So, I know a lot of people are firm believers in, you have to look at people in order to indicate that you are paying attention to them. And so people will perceive knitting as a distraction, but once you have developed that ability to knit without looking, you will be able to sit and make progress on whatever it is you're doing while listening to a lecture or attending a town hall meeting, or again, watching a movie. Even if you have to read the subtitles, you'll be able to do that. So if you picture knitting as just sitting on your sofa, staring at your hands, that maybe might sound a little boring. But once you have developed those skills, knitting is kind of like a companion. It's something you are doing while you are doing other things. You are actively producing something that eventually you're probably going to wear, which is also not boring. And so you'll come to realize that while you might actually enjoy just sitting on the couch and knitting, it doesn't have to be like that. You can do a lot of other things while you knit. As in addition, knitting is actually really good for you. Even if you perceive it as a little bit boring, it is a really good way to relax, assuming you're not working on a super difficult pattern that is maybe giving you some trouble. Sort of the rhythmic nature of knitting and just, sitting at peace, getting out any sort of built up energy through your hands, through this repetitive motion. It can really help to reduce anxiety. And it's also a creative outlet, which is also good for people to have. So again, I guess it's a matter of opinion, but I really wouldn't call knitting boring. Myth number 4, it's cheaper to buy things. My response to that is it really depends on your perception of how you spend your money. If you're only thinking short term, it is probably cheaper to go to Walmart and buy a $10 hat or a big pack of socks in the short term. But in the long term, if you knit yourself a hat out of some good quality materials, that hat might last you 10 years. And maybe you spent $25 on the yarn. If you get that $10 Walmart hat and it's made out of something cheap, and you have to buy a new one every 2 or 3 years, then over that 10-year span, that cheap hat is going to cost you more in the long run because you keep having to rebuy it. And the same is true of pretty much anything when you're comparing your knit garments, knit items to shopping at Walmart, Target, any place that is mass producing clothing that is of relatively low quality, meaning that the materials themselves are lower quality and the construction of whatever it is also lower quality, because the emphasis is on fast and cheap and not on hard wearing. You have seams in your garments that are weak. You have stitches that get dropped and gradually unravel. You have the material itself, which isn't designed really to stand up to long-term wear and tear. Now, of course, if you are already buying yourself very high quality handmade items elsewhere, that's a different story. But in terms of sort of fast fashion, mass-produced clothing versus hand-knit garments, in the short term, sure, it's probably cheaper to buy, but in the long term, it actually ends up being cheaper to make your own, knit your own, because things are just going to last longer and you're not going to have to keep replacing them. And finally, myth number 5, sort of in the same vein, this is a tricky one. You have some people who think that knitting is a cheap hobby, and then you have some people who think knitting is an expensive hobby. And the reality is that knitting can be as cheap or as expensive as you want it to be. So in terms of getting started with knitting, you can go to your local big box craft store and get yarn and a pair of knitting needles for probably $10 and get started. So that's pretty cheap. However, as you become more invested in knitting, you will ultimately probably be interested in buying better quality materials, better quality tools, and you will probably need more of them. So if you just want to knit a plain scarf, thinking about my sister here, you really only need one set of knitting needles and the yarn to match. Knitting needles have different sizes though, depending on what kind of yarn you use. A thicker yarn, you need a bigger needle. So as you start to want to knit more and different things, you'll probably have to get more needles in more sizes. You might want sturdier needles. You might want circular needles for knitting things in the round and straight needles for something else. Again, you might want nicer yarn. So if you've ever been to a local yarn store and thought, oh, yarn is so expensive, those by and large are hand-dyed yarns produced by independent dyers. And that's why they are more expensive, because they are using better quality materials to start with, and then they're hand dyeing the yarn, so that you're paying for their artistry as well. If you go to, Michael's and get a ball of the Vanna White yarn, that's sort of a mass-produced yarn. The quality of the wool probably isn't as nice. It might not be as soft. It might be not really wool. It might be nylon, other things mixed in. So that's why that yarn is less expensive. So going back to my original point, knitting can be a cheap hobby. It can also be an expensive hobby. It really just depends on the knitter and where they want to go with it. So I taught my sister to knit about 6 years ago. And since then, she has knit and lost quite a number of plain garter stitch scarves. That's really all she has an interest in. It's, again, very meditative to just sit and knit kind of the same thing, helps reduce anxiety. She can do it while she watches TV, and then she just gets a very kind of basic scarf that she can wear. And she didn't spend, tons of money on the yarn or the knitting needles. So when she loses it, she doesn't, get too upset about that, because there was not a lot of investment there. So especially since she got the knitting needles and the yarn from me, from stuff I don't use anymore. So if you know a knitter and are interested in taking some leftover yarn and old needles off their hands, knitting can be basically a zero investment hobby for you. But again, for her, because she's not interested in learning to knit sweaters, she just wants to knit a scarf. That's a pretty cheap hobby. If you're like me, I started knitting in 2007, and I think the first thing I knit was a hat. But I just fell way into that rabbit hole, and now I am just surrounded by yarn and knitting needles and patterns, And it is not a cheap hobby for me, but it is one I love very much, that brings a lot of joy to my life, and I consider that investment worth it. So in terms of that last myth, knitting is as cheap or expensive as you want it to be. I hope you enjoyed this myth busting. If you're interested in learning how to knit after watching this, I hope you'll check out my series of free knitting tutorials, Knitting 101, where I teach you the basics of knitting, and we also go through how to get those initial materials that you need to get started. If you are already a knitter and you are interested in sweater knitting and improving your sweater knitting, I'm going to include a link down below to my e-course Sweater Siren, which is starting up on June 27th, and I hope you will check that out. Thanks so much for joining me. I'll see you next time.